Hello everyone, welcome to our audiobook channel. If you enjoy this story or want to hear more exciting content, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Your feedback helps us improve and bring even more captivating stories. Enjoy listening. Dark Journey, Secrets and Nightmares on the Streets of Santiago is a book about a man's pilgrimage that becomes his darkest nightmare as secrets emerge and ghosts haunt his path. A woman has disappeared on the Camino de Santiago, the ancient 500-mile pilgrimage across northern Spain. Daniel, an Irish expatriate, walks the lonely path carrying the ashes of his wife Petra, along with the horrifying secret of how she really died. When he teams up with sporty California girl Ginny to walk, she seems like the perfect antidote to his grieving heart. But a nightmarish spectre begins to stalk them, and his mind begins to shatter with the horror of things he cannot explain. Unexpected twists and turns echo on the ancient trail they traverse. The lines begin to blur between reality and insanity, between the truth and the lies we tell ourselves. Chapter 9. Espinosa to Hotel Las Vegas. Wake up, Daniel. Daniel looks up into the half-light of the albergue bedroom and sees Ginny standing over him, dressed for the road. What time is it? I don't know. It's almost dawn, I guess. She searches around the room, as if expecting the dawn to creep up behind her. I just want to get started early. I was hoping to make it to Burgos today. Burgos is a lot farther than Daniel had planned to walk, close to 25 miles, but he doesn't want to be left behind. He sits up in his sleeping bag and runs a hand through his unruly bedhead hair. Give me a second to get ready. I'll meet you outside. The coolness of the mist strikes Daniel as he opens the front door of the albergue. The temperature has dropped significantly overnight. He can't see the pub across the street and can only barely make out Ginny in the road waiting for him, fading in and out in the curls of heavy fog. He has little time to snap on his new headlamp before she starts making her way west along the cobblestone street. Is everything all right? He asks her, catching up. Yeah, I just want to get out of here. That guy gives me the creeps. The Englishman. Yeah, him. Mark. He's such an idiot. What was all that nonsense he said about your friend? They hadn't had a chance to talk after last night. Ginny was so upset she went straight to bed. He must have seen me with Rob and then he saw me with you. I guess that makes me a Camino slut or something in his eyes. The guy's full of shit. Daniel nods in agreement, the light from his headlamp bobbing up and down. You're right. He is that. A farm animal makes an explosive snort close by, but neither of them can see where from. Between the darkness and the mist, visibility is reduced to just a few yards ahead as they walk, even with his headlamp. Sure, he wasn't wrong about that missing woman, though. Daniel continues. I was looking it up on the internet last night. Even in a blip on the map like Espinosa they had Wi-Fi. She disappeared at the end of the summer outside Mazarife. Probably got sick of the trail. Some people can't hack it. They'll find her holed up at a resort in Costa del Sol, drinking sangrias with the Cabana boy. Perhaps, Daniel says, unsure. I reckon it's still a good idea to stick together, in any case. He treads carefully with this last comment. He doesn't want another lecture on how she doesn't need him to take care of her. That's cool with me, she says, although her full concentration is on the path rather than the conversation. She is moving quickly, with long, confident strides through the poor visibility, like a car overdriving its headlights. He needs to hurry to keep up. It must have been quite a ruining she had with the Englishman for her to want to put this much distance between them. Ginny was something after happening, you know, with your one. With who? With the Englishman. He doesn't usually push people with personal questions. But if there is something going on here he thinks he needs to know. He tried to grab me once, she says matter-of-factly. After we all came back from dinner one night. Went to Copperfield when he said goodnight. Daniel feels a twinge of guilt over his own grasping thoughts the night they shared a room. Jesus, Ginny. You should have told me. So you could have really got into it with him. Like a couple of Neanderthals? I don't think so. What if we meet up with him again? You need to let me at least have a word with him, Ginny. Have a word was a euphemism for Daniel here, meaning smack upside the head. Please don't, she says. He was drunk like he was last night. Not like that's an excuse. She looks behind her and so does he. There is a faint ball of light being dispersed through the haze. The sun is coming up. She turns to him, slowing down a bit. Just leave it, Daniel, he's not worth it. You shouldn't have to feel like you have to run away from him, he tells her, trying to keep his Neanderthalness in check. I'm not running away from him. I'm just not a big fan of conflict. Neither is Daniel. Although in this case he'd like to make an exception. You're surely moving fast for someone who's not running away. I just don't want to have my Camino spoiled by a jerk like him, all right. She is silent after that. Daniel knows he should let it go, but there is one more thing he feels compelled to ask her. What was he meaning by that last comment? About it not being your first Camino. I told you, Daniel, he's just a dick. She steps up the pace again. He nods and keeps up with her. On this point he is in full agreement. They continue at a rapid rate even as the fog mixes with fat drops of rain. Even when the increasing warmth of the day makes them sticky inside their tightly tied jacket hoods. Between the water dripping down his face and the murky morning drizzle, Daniel is missing most of the waymarks. Sometimes he's lucky enough to spot a watery flash of yellow floating out of the gloom on the side of a tree or painted onto a rock. But he would have to walk over and stand right in front of it to determine which way the arrow is pointing. Ginny keeps them on course despite her frenzied pace, never stopping to watch for markers. Or so it seems. He turns his headlamp off after a while. She doesn't appear to need it, and it makes little difference for him in these dense conditions. Her behavior seems a bit overblown, but he's willing to let it pass. He's hardly the one to make judgment on erratic behavior these days. He lets her guide them both through the cloud-covered hills, not asking any more questions as they twist and turn along the Camino, never getting lost. The rain is starting to ease up a bit by the time they hit Atapuerca. There are standing stones here, like Stonehenge but not as grand. They remind Daniel of the ones they have in the Burren, a rocky-meadow part of Ireland not far from the cliffs of Moher. He is disappointed when he finds out these ones are fakes, replicas erected to mark the spot where the bones of Europe's oldest skeleton were found. 400,000 years old, Ginny translates from the historical plaque, finally stopping for the first time this morning. Wow. I wonder why he fancied this place to settle. Daniel observes the lowly but otherwise unremarkable valley as he leans on one of the stones for a rest. Though, I suppose 400,000 years can surely change a place. True, Ginny says. This might have been a lake we're walking through and the poor guy drowned trying to catch sturgeon for dinner. She looks at her wrist as if there might be a watch there, but there is only the bracelet, its glass beads and shells glistening wet with moisture. Daniel shudders slightly at the sight of it but passes it off as a shiver from the weather. Once more he steadies himself with the reassurance of facts. The sturgeon, now that's an ancient fish, dates back to the time of the dinosaurs, long before this boy came along. Now the saber-toothed salmon, Ginny walks back over to the path, waits for him expectantly. We better get going, she says. It's still 11 miles before Burgos. 4 tour buses pull into a parking lot to the north of them, spewing out visitors into an interpretive center as the rain starts in earnest again. Old skeletons are almost as big business as wine. Daniel readjusts the weight of his pack on his back with a shoulder shrug, then joins her, keeping his knowledge of the extinct salmon and its vicious teeth to himself. Some people just don't appreciate a good fish story. The gradual rise of the Sierra out of Atapuerca has become a steep, craggy slope. The stones are slippery, and Daniel is reminded of his hike down the side of Alto del Perdon, the day he tried to spread the ashes, the day he met Ginny. At least the fog has burnt off, and he can see what he's doing. He and Ginny pick their way up the rocky incline, testing each sharp stone before putting the full weight of a boot down. The need for concentration on the hard climb keeps them quiet, although they do manage to comment on a military training site they parallel. Only a barbed wire fence a few feet off the Camino separates them from it. Warning signs with sincere exclamation points are nailed onto trees in the dense forest on the other side of the barrier, Cuidado, which Ginny explains is Spanish for keep the hell out. Daniel doesn't need to be told. His last experience in a Spanish wood is enough to make him stick close to the trail, like a reformed Irish Red Riding Hood. His calves are screaming by the time they reach the crest at the high point of the Sierra. It is flat like a tabletop, as if the peak had been chopped off neatly with an axe. The evenness of the terrain is a relief, and the new angle stretches the cramped muscles at the back of his legs like a good massage. It stays flat like this for another half hour before they reach the end of the tabletop and look down on the next valley, waterlogged and hungry. Ginny finally gives in. "Let's take a break," she says, aiming for a bench under a lofty wooden pole cross that stands watch over the valley. Daniel isn't about to argue. He drops his pack on the ground and sits on the bench beside her, stretching out his legs. Tall grass in the fields below them moves in waves with the wind. Off in the distance he can see modern buildings and concrete, the outskirts of the city of Burgos. The rain must have stopped a while ago. You get used to bad weather after walking in it for a few hours, so you no longer notice it even when it's gone. "Thank you," Ginny says, after they've wolfed down a couple of crunchy power bars with some water. She pulls down her hood. Her long bangs are plastered to her forehead, wet where they peek out the front. She still looks good. For what he drops his own hood feels the pleasing warmth of sun. The clouds are clearing along with the rain. "For not bugging me about wanting to get out of Espinosa. I know I was being unreasonable. I can understand why you'd want to be rid of that shite," Daniel says, wiping some water off his face where it has dripped down from his hair. "Yes, but most guys would get all testosterone about it," she says, facing him. "Are you after doubting my male hormones?" "No, just appreciate you keeping them in check." Her voice sounds like there should be a wink with this comment. She clears her throat instead. "I mean, you respected what I wanted. Stuck with me even though you were acting crackers." "Yes, that. I suppose I should be thanking you for the same favor." He stops smiling at this, starts digging into his backpack for his hat as a diversion tactic. "Simon, Daniel, we talked about this, I told you." He holds up a hand, interrupting her. He doesn't want to rehash the whole thing again either. Some things are best dealt with by leaving them be, I reckon. She nods. He eventually finds the hat, puts it on the bench beside him rather than putting it on. Besides, denial is a cultural imperative in Ireland. We're good at it. Got the lot of us through multiple famines. "Really," she says, challenging but playful. "Sure, that's why alcoholism plagued the nation for so many generations. Numb the mind. Deny the obvious. Even starving to death. Even that." A couple of other pilgrims arrive and the two of them raise a hand in greeting. It's a man and woman, and they ask Daniel to take a picture of them standing with the backdrop of the valley. The man wraps his arm around the woman's waist and they both pose, beaming for the camera. After they thank Daniel, they walk away holding hands and quietly chatting as they move out of sight. The woman laughs at something the man says, leaning into him. He and Ginny watch as the two follow the serpentine path of the Camino down into the valley, the design meant to lessen the force of the decline even as it makes the trip longer. Daniel can hear the couple long after he can no longer see them. The intimacy of their conversation carries back along the open air to the two of them, sitting on the bench under the cross. "Tell me about the good stuff." Hardened Daniel had almost forgotten Ginny was there. "The good stuff about your wife," she says. "About Petra." "Yeah. You told me last night about when she was sick. What was she like before that?" Daniel hasn't talked about this in a while. People were always more interested in Petra's death than they were her life. She was an artist. He's not sure where to start, but Petra's art is as good a place as any. She painted mostly. although she could create anything with her hands. She used all forms of medium: clay, metal, dirt. He says. She was a force of nature. One Christmas, she used a box of old Star Wars toys to build a nativity scene. Daniel's mouth turns up in a half smile at the memory. You're joking, Ginny says, her eyes wide. Yoda was after being the baby Jesus. Our Lady was played by R2-D2. He can see the little characters all lined up in the holy stable Petra created from popsicle sticks and dry grass from the backyard. Sure, it sounds like a kid thing, but she often did things like that. She taught second grade. Was always looking for ways to delight the children. She lived for it. He swallows after the last sentence, struck by the irony that Petra and he were never able to have children of their own, but perhaps in retrospect it had been for the best. She even did magic tricks, he adds, forcing himself back into remembering good things. Like with cards. The young ones weren't so interested in cards. You need something cleverer than that to impress an 8-year-old. Or something with animals. The kids just loved the animals. We owned a white rabbit named Ollie that got a fair bit of experience jumping out of hats. That's amazing. Ginny claps her hands together in delight. What other tricks did she do? Oh, making things disappear and reappear. The little ones like that as well. Just a form of hide-and-seek, really. They weren't easy to do, of course. She'd practice for weeks to get a trick working right. Sure, the one with the dove pan was pure genius. Took her months to perfect. A dove pan. It's a metal pan with a lid, so, Daniel explains. You pour in some flammable liquid and set the whole lot on fire. Then you put the lid on to douse it, say the magic words, and when you take the lid off again, a white dove appears. Tada! Daniel mimes a dramatic flourish with his hands. He can remember Petra working for hours in the kitchen on that illusion, the flames from the pan lighting up her face, the white dove tucked protectively under her arm. The ceiling had a scorch mark from all the practice she'd put into getting the trick right. He hadn't noticed it until long after Petra had to give up performing magic. Then he left it there as a reminder of how she used to be. I think I would have liked her, Ginny says. I think you would have, he says, picking up his hat from the bench, then holding it by the wide brim in his lap. She was forced to give up her job when she got too ill, of course. Give up the magic. Came to a point where she couldn't even work in her studio anymore. That was the beginning of the end, so to speak. When she couldn't paint anymore, he finally puts the hat on his head, pushes a wet lock of hair off his forehead. She had to stay in bed most of the time by then. I set up some of her oils and such on a breakfast tray, but it got where she was too weak to lift the brush. That would have been hard. On both of you. Cancer is a right cunning thief, he says, thinking of his bubbly, energetic wife confined to the narrow life of the bedridden. It stole Petra away long before she was gone. She lost so much of herself, of who she was before she lost her life. He leans down and starts to fuss with the rain cover on his backpack so he doesn't have to look directly at Ginny as he speaks. Sometimes I'd come to the hospital after work and find her stuck in the same position as I'd left her in that morning. It hurt too much for her to move. He pushes the cover back into its pouch at the base of the bag even though it's still wet. I didn't know what to do to help. I reckon that was the worst thing. Every time I asked what I could do to make things better, she'd tell me she was fine. He pulls hard on the soggy zipper for the pouch and it catches. What harm? I was watching her slip away and nothing I could do made a difference. He keeps tugging on the zipper. It must have made you angry, Ginny says. He looks up at her, his mouth a tight line. He abandons the half-zipped pouch. That sounds terrible. Being angry at a person for being sick. But he knows she's right. He had been angry not at Petra, though never at Petra, he tells himself. Only at the desperate fuck-up of a situation they were in. He looks down to see that the couple had taken a picture of earlier have reached the bottom of the trail now, 2 small dots with matching Panama hats moving among the waving grass. You know my friend, the one who was supposed to come on the Camino with me. Ginny's gaze is fixed out across the valley as well. Yes. He's not sure where she's going with this, but he appreciates the change of subject. She had problems. Ginny screws her eyes up at the sun as it makes its way fully out from behind a receding rain cloud. We'd been good friends when we were growing up but lost touch. You know how people do. Daniel knows. Some of the men he still calls his best friends he hasn't seen more than once in the last 10 years. Men are poor at keeping up their friendships, Petra had once told him, and he supposes at least in his case it's true. She became a writer. Signed a 3-book deal for some chick-lit crime series. Would I know the book? Not exactly Daniel's genre. He's more of a Terry Pratchett kind of guy. But Petra always liked a good whodunit, as long as the female characters weren't cliched bimbos that made her throw the book at the bedroom wall. No, you wouldn't know it, Ginny says, head down. She never finished writing it. The publisher asked for the advance back, and by then she had spent it all on stuff to ease the pain of writer's block, if you know what I mean. Ginny looks up at him with a wry smile, but there's no mirth in it. Sort of went downhill from there, I heard. That was years ago. So how did you meet up again? Ginny sighs hard before she replies, as if she needs to make space in her lungs for the answer. I went to a party thrown by some old friends and bumped into her there. It was right around the time I was planning this trip. Made the mistake of telling her about it. She wanted to come along. I knew she was in recovery, on methadone, the whole bit. What did you say? I told her I'd think about it. People warned me not to bring her, but we'd been so close once. God, was she ever fun back then. Ginny sips on her water bottle. When we were teenagers we used to go out clubbing in our miniskirts and high heels. 2 young things on the prowl with fake ID. One time I got my stiletto caught in a grate and couldn't get it out. I had to leave it behind. 1 shoe on, 1 barefoot. She took off one of her own high heels and ran around with me like that in solidarity. We looked ridiculous, but damn it, did we ever laugh. Daniel looks at Ginny and nods. He understands what it is to long for the way things used to be. Sure, you thought maybe things would be like that again if you took her on the Camino with you. Yes. She holds the water bottle protectively on her lap. But she was so different. I thought I knew her, but she'd changed so much since I last saw her. She pauses, caught up in the memory. Daniel thinks she must be finished with the story, but then she continues, speaking more hurriedly than before. We tried to train before we came here. She came up and stayed with me for a week in Berkeley so we could. But she was very tearful, needy. We'd go for hikes and have to break every few minutes for her to take a supplement or drink water to stave off one of her dehydration headaches. She stops for a second, then glances up at him. And she had this thing about chanting. Chanting. Yeah. We'd be out, and she would sit down wherever we were and start chanting. She had chants for strength, chants to ward off negative thoughts. She turns to Daniel and smiles. Chants for blood sugar imbalance. That's after being a bit specific. She said she had prediabetes. And prehypertension. Oh, and post-addiction withdrawal syndrome. I can't remember all the conditions she had, except they were all pre or post, like she didn't have the wherewithal to be fully ill in the present. Ginny makes a hollow laugh. I don't mean to make fun. She wasn't well mentally. I understood that. But after a while it made me angry, too. Like you got angry about Petra. Petra wasn't like that. Daniel doesn't like the comparison Ginny's drawing with the 2 situations. His wife was nothing like this woman. If anything, she didn't complain enough. Sure, Petra was really sick. My friend was sick too, Ginny says, focusing on the water bottle. He supposes she's right, but he doesn't feel like getting into a philosophical discussion on mental versus physical afflictions. So, what happened, he asks instead. With what Ginny starts as if she just woke up from a dream. With your friend, why didn't she come so? She overdosed. Ginny spits out the words without emotion. She relapsed before we left, died on the bathroom floor of her parents' place. Jesus, that's a terrible thing, Ginny. He hadn't been expecting this ending. Assumed that Ginny had just decided her friend was too much trouble to bring along. He reaches out and gently lays his hand on hers, feels how cold her fingers are through the thin gloves she wears. She doesn't pull away, not at first. Yes, it is, she says. Then she stands up from the bench abruptly, her hand slips out from under his. She takes one last hit from her water bottle, finishing it off. Let's get going. I want to make it into the city center tonight. She starts walking hurriedly toward the trail and then turns with a nervous laugh, returning to retrieve her backpack from the base of the cross. In her haste, Shed almost left it behind. It is hours later before the two of them give up on making it into Burgos proper. Trudging on the punishing cement in the suburb of Villafria, they cringe as planes cross low in the air overhead. Exhaust from local traffic grates on their throats. Forced to take accommodation on the seedy airport strip, they decide on the Hotel Las Vegas, a former 4-star trying to keep up appearances as a 1.5. The glossy marble stairway in the lobby speaks of a grander time, but the tarnished mirrors and water-stained wallpaper in the hallways tell the real story. Daniel keeps expecting to see a neon sign outside flashing girls, girls, girls. Ginny goes directly up to her room, citing the late hour, and Daniel grabs a stale bocadillo from the hotel snack bar before going up to his. He takes a bath, trying to touch as little of the tub as possible, then sets up on the bed with his feet propped up to skite his sister. How far did you walk today? Angela asks him from the tiny screen of his phone. Head called her as soon as he was settled, catching her at the end of a CSI rerun. 24 miles, he tells her, chomping down hard on the rock-like bread of the bocadillo. The cheese inside sticks to the roof of his mouth. How far is that in kilometers, you ficking yank? 38, Daniel says, still chewing. Are you mad? Angela asks him. He winces a little at that, but she doesn't seem to notice. Nah, I don't think so. He swallows another lump of sandwich. It's only Ginny wanted to get to Burgos. It is out of his mouth before he thinks about it. Ginny's name, not the lump of sandwich. So, it's Ginny now that you're walking with. And now you find yourself at the Hotel Las Vegas. Isn't that a fine bit of providence? Listen, don't be teasing, Angela. There's been some trouble on the Camino. Women after being harassed. One even disappeared off the trail. I don't fancy Ginny walking alone at the moment. I'm certain you don't. He still feels like he needs to make excuses. And does this Egypt that's been bothering her? An Englishman. Well, he's obviously a hazard then. Can't trust that lot. Angela, he says, drawing her name out in warning. All right, she says, laughing. He can see her blow on the surface of a cup of tea, the mug held up with 2 hands wrapped around to warm them. You just mind yourself, little brother. Don't go getting the shite kicked out of yourself defending a damsel in distress. Sure, that wouldn't be very pilgrim-like. St. James would turn over in his shrine. They both laugh this time. Oh, listen, she says all of a sudden, remembering something. She takes a tentative sip of the hot tea. Did you call Gerald's wife? Shite, I forgot. Daniel puts the bocadillo down, starts searching for the piece of paper with the phone number on it. Don't bother. She's gone to her mass. I talked to her this morning. Seems your partner's done a runner on her. Go on, that doesn't sound like Gerald. Oh, I'd wager that man has seen inside a few Hotel Las Vegases since he's been married. Daniel knows this is true, but he didn't realize that Angela did. He owes money, serious. Gambling debts. Feckin' hell. Daniel has cursed more on this phone call than he has in the whole last week, although he supposes feckin' is a substitute swear and doesn't really count. His father always told him that only the uncreative had to replace an adjective with a curse. But what does she expect me to do about it? He asks his sister. How the hell do I know? Angela says. But my guess would be she wants you to sign the papers to sell the business to that New York firm that's so hot for the two of you in order to pay off the hoodlums. There is a deep pause. He puts the bocadillo down on the bedside table. "I'm not at all sure I'm ready to sell," he says meekly, waiting for the explosion. He's not disappointed. Why the hell not? Angela slams her tea down on the table in her apartment in Dublin. It's a fierce amount of money. And you're coming home anyway. She moves forward, filling up the screen. "You are coming home, Danny." "Sure, I could come home and still keep my side of the business," he counters. A silent partner, so. He had thought about this more and more in the days before he left for the Camino and since, but hadn't dared to voice it. "I built that company up from nothing, Angie." Petra, too, in the office before she went teaching. He picks up the sandwich again and takes an angry bite. He doesn't like being told what to do. Angela's sigh is both audible and visible on the Skype feed. "All I'm saying is it would be a fair turn to Cynthia if you were to sell now." Honestly, Daniel, the woman was right cut up on the phone. "Not to mention Dad. I told you, I think the farm may need more than your presence. Things were devastating here after the downturn. They thought the banks might fail, for God's sake. I don't know if Dad ever fully recovered from it. The market's gone to shite. If he has to sell, he might not have much left afterward." Daniel is shocked and worried about this piece of news, feels like crap about it, actually. He could still come over and help his dad, he reasons, but keep his place back in the States. The house, the business, it's all he has left of Petra. He can't abandon that any more than he can abandon the memory of the Snow White hospital pillow. "I need to talk to Gerald. He's out on a tear, as I told you before. I don't know why you give a right testicle about what that man thinks. His sister can be graphic when frustrated. Do you know he asked me about having you declared incompetent back when you were having your troubles after Petra? He doesn't care about anyone but himself, Daniel." "Jesus, are you serious?" He had told Gerald about the night with the Ambien, sleepwalking into the muffin-baking missus. Bodis Backard was embarrassing, but surely it hadn't made him incompetent. He realizes in the last year he had come a little unhinged, but he didn't think it showed. Obviously, it had. Angela softens a little. "I didn't want to tell you at the time. But in retrospect, I suppose he was more interested in taking that offer than he was willing to let on. I wager he already knew he was for it at the time. What harm, but I was after buying a postcard to send to that bastard. You think you know a man. Gerald could be a social climbing twit, but not a backstabbing one at last check." "Jesus," Daniel says a second time, then loudly burps up the acrid taste of stale bocadillo. "Well said." Angela lifts her eyebrows at him from across the Skype feed. She takes another deep sip of her tea and leans into the camera of her laptop. "Seriously, Daniel, you're not always a good judge of people having your best interests at heart. Just mind yourself." "I will," he says, wiping crumbs from his face with a napkin. "I mean, I am." That night Daniel dreams of the Englishman following them over the Sierra like a loping wolf. He and Ginny reach the tall cross overlooking the Burgos Valley, and she starts to cry. Someone is nailed to it. He doesn't want to look up to see who, even as he sees the blood dripping from the muddy hiking boots nailed to the shaft. The rat from the forest cemetery where he last saw them perches on the toe, licking at the blood. He wakes up damp with sweat to hear the dying end of a scream. It could have been his own, but he is convinced it came from across the hall of the hotel. Jumping out of bed, he runs to Ginny's room and bangs on the door calling for her. She doesn't answer, doesn't respond, even after he has convinced the sleeping concierge to open the locked door with his master key. When he does, they find the room empty, the bed not slept in. No one is there. The pissed-off concierge trudges back down the sticky marble stairs to the front desk, cursing him in Spanish. Daniel is left standing in the hallway in his stocking feet, staring at the empty room and wondering whether it is possible to really know anybody at all. Chapter 10. Hotel Las Vegas to Rab de las Calzadas. Daniel feels conspicuous coming into Burgos, a modern city humming with the morning commute. Women in colourful dresses look bored waiting for the bus. Billboards shout unintelligible Spanish at him from atop apartment blocks. People hurry past on the crowded sidewalk, parting around him as if he's a stone against their current. His backpack and hiking boots give him away as a pilgrim among the smartly dressed urban Spaniards, earn him an occasional half-hearted buen camino. He doesn't enjoy standing out. When he passes a uniformed employee sweeping the front steps of a 3-story Burger King, he thinks about going in, if only to hide in the branded familiarity. He decides against it when a group of teenagers in a car leaking base pull up to the drive-thru and honk at him. A man needs to draw the line somewhere on a spiritual quest. As he crosses the street with the green light, he wonders again what he did that caused Ginny to run off. He had grilled the concierge for details of her exit but couldn't make himself properly understood. The man was either trying to tell him that she never asked for a room, or that she never ordered the fish. He wasn't sure which. He needed to use the translator on his phone to even get that far. Or maybe the concierge was just being cagey, figuring Daniel had been left on purpose. Perhaps he had gone too far yesterday, spooked Ginny when he took her hand. Feckin' hell, maybe he's as bad as the Englishman and right now she's sprinting out of Burgos just to get away from him. He wouldn't be surprised. He has not exactly been good company on this trip with his maudlin talk of a dying wife and horror show hallucinations. In retrospect, he doesn't blame her for wanting to distance herself. He'd leave himself behind if he could. The city's main plaza takes the edge off his mood. It soothes him with its timelessness, an oasis of antiquity. Cobblestones replace asphalt. Traditional cafes and storefronts replace fast food joints. Even the locals seem on a different time continuum, lounging over coffee and pastry on outdoor patios despite the cool morning. The heavy 12th century stone architecture insulates the square from the fast-paced world that surrounds it. Towering over it all, grand and Gothic, stands the Burgos Basilica, one of Spain's largest cathedrals. Daniel sees the 2 imposing barbed limestone towers that frame the main entrance and remembers the style is referred to as squelette, the French word for skeleton. He also remembers what lies behind those fortified walls, had seen it in the guidebook and decides to take a chance. I thought I'd find you here. Ginny doesn't turn around at the sound of Daniel's voice despite the hush of the empty side chapel gallery. It is early, and few tourists have arrived. Cathedral de Santa Maria holds many artistic treasures, and the oil painting before Ginny is no exception. Santa Maria de Magdalena is inscribed on the placard next to it, right above Da Vinci's name. Leonardo didn't even paint it, Ginny says, not bothering to turn around. Or at least, not entirely. He probably did the outline and one of his students completed it. She tilts her head, observing the painting at a different angle. Her hair falls against her shoulder without the burden of its usual ponytail. He might have done the face, though, I think. The face of the Magdalena is remarkable. Her chin and eyes are angled upward and to the left, as if she is trying to catch a glimpse of something without detection. Her arms cross in front of her bare breasts both seductively and protectively. She holds back an impending smile. If it weren't for her generous lips, she could be the Mona Lisa's sister. Why did you leave, Ginny? I don't do conflict well, I told you that, she says flatly. Sure, I'm not a big fan of it myself. It's more than that. She tears her eyes away from the painting. I have a history of running away from things. Like Mark the Englishman, he says. Yeah, I suppose. But more than that. She goes to sit down on one of the cool marble benches, leans over and takes her head in her hands. Daniel joins her on the bench, his backpack wedged behind him on the seat back. The portrait of Mary Magdalene views them from the adjacent wall, as if part of the conversation. I ran away from home when I was 16, she says, still not looking up. Sure, that's young. Daniel imagines a 16-year-old girl fending for herself in California and all the lowlifes that might try and prey on her. How bad could things have been for Ginny to choose that over home? Did you have problems with your parents? He asks gently. Sister, she says. You mentioned you didn't get on. That would be an understatement. She lifts her head from her hands, narrows her gaze. People think only men can be violent, but women can be just as bad. My sister was missing something, I'm not sure what. Basic empathy for sure, but it was more than that. Daniel waits for her to go on. She would think up creative ways to hurt me, Ginny says. From the time I was little. She and her best friend, Sheena. Ginny looks across the room. Sheena had a little sister, too. The kids called her Twitchy Trish. Only I knew why, I suppose. She was so fucking scared all the time. So was I. What did they do to you? Daniel asks softly. He knows bad memories are best treated gently. They'd stuff us into old sleeping bags and kick us down the stairs, Ginny says, stating the facts dispassionately to distance herself. Catch us and cut our fingers open with sharp blades of grass when we played in the sprinkler on the lawn. She runs her finger along the cool white stone of the bench as if to soothe the old injury. Sometimes they'd perform experiments and make us participate. The two of them held me down once and covered my mouth to see how long I could go without breathing. They made Trish keep time. I still remember how her hand trembled holding the stopwatch, afraid she'd be next. Then I lost consciousness. We couldn't have been more than 5. Jesus. Daniel had heard of sisters clashing with each other, but nothing like this. Once we got older and bigger, they couldn't pull shit like that anymore, Ginny says. But they still found their opportunities. My sister would drop broken glass on the bathroom floor before I got out of the shower. Trish found straight pins buried in a jar of cream she'd had prescribed by the doctor for her eczema. I knew because we'd become close friends by then. Bound together for survival of our own siblings, I guess. Why didn't your parents do something? Our parents were oblivious, Ginny says, showing her first sign of anger. Mine were too busy watching their marriage disintegrate, and hers were never home. When they did notice anything was going on, they wrote it off as the usual kid stuff. Ginny holds onto the bench tightly with both of her hands, as if the force of her story might catapult her off it. No one wants to believe they've given birth to monsters, she says. So, you left. Daniel speaks the words like a secret. The only way to speak in a hushed cathedral or when discussing monsters. One day, Ginny begins, when I was in the bathtub, I must have left the door open or she picked the lock. My sister knew how to do things like that. I looked up and she was standing over me with the hair dryer in her hands. It was plugged in and she turned it on. She dangled it over the water, smiling. Then she took the cordless phone in her other hand and called Sheena. She just sat there on the edge of the tub for half an hour, talking to her friend on the phone, the two of them laughing and carrying on. The whir of the hair dryer only inches away from me. I didn't dare move. The water got colder and colder. My teeth were chattering. I could see the blue veins under my skin. Jesus, Ginny. He pictures her, a terrified kid, shivering in the tub. An entire childhood spent looking over her shoulder. He knew she had been harboring something frightening but hadn't been prepared for something so domestically sinister. I don't know what would have happened if my dad hadn't started pounding on the door demanding to know where my mother was, she says, breaking the tension slightly with her musing. He would notice that his dinner wasn't made when he got home, but not that his eldest daughter was a psychopath. Ginny shifts on the bench, swallows hard, then sits up straighter. So, I took off after that. Hitchhiked north, got a job, and finished school at night. I never went back. I just ran away. You were afraid for your life, I say. I saved my own ass, is what I say. Ginny raises the pitch of her voice but not her volume. Her next sentence comes out in a sharp whisper. I ran and I left my best friend behind with the monsters. Sheena's little sister, Daniel says, and she nods. Then he realizes. The old friend, that's who she is. The one you were bringing on the Camino with you. Yes, Ginny says, gazing up at the portrait again. Ah, Ginny, it's not your fault. You had to go. Daniel rests a hand on her upper arm. The nylon of her jacket crinkles under his fingers. She shudders a little but doesn't pull away. I wish it were that easy, she says, sighing. I can't help thinking, if I hadn't left her there, if I had been braver, if I hadn't run away, that things would have been different. For her. Right, like you're responsible for her becoming an addict or her overdose. Go on, Ginny. You can't hang that on yourself. But I do. She leans away from him, and his hand falls between them again. And I don't want to do the same to you, Daniel. To hurt you because I can't handle things. I'm always going to run when the situation gets, volatile. Always. Do you think I'm volatile? Daniel asks, trying to keep his speech steady. No, she says, running one hand over the smooth marble of the bench. Besides, it's not just that. She gets up and moves across the chapel to stand in front of a richly carved stone sarcophagus. A dead bishop, judging by the pointy hat. I don't know whether I'm good for you, Daniel. She glances back across her shoulder. You're seeing these things and this woman. Did you ever think that maybe I'm to blame? That you're to blame? Daniel gets up from the bench and crosses over to stand behind her. Sure, what could you possibly have to do with it? She doesn't answer at first, then abruptly turns around to face him. Tell me, Daniel, she asks. Do I remind you of Petra? He is floored by the question. Of course, there are aspects of Ginny that remind him of Petra. And there was that first time he had seen her at Alto del Perdon, the mistake he had made. But he had never told Ginny about that, and he isn't about to now. She reaches up with one hand, rests her fingers lightly on his chest. I worry sometimes that you're mixing Petra and me up. Maybe it was memories of her at the end that made you see that woman when you saw me in the graveyard. Daniel's body stiffens, and she takes her hand away. Petra never looked like that. Then again, the sunken cheeks, the flesh in a state of decay even as his wife still lived and breathed. There were similarities. I just don't want to make things worse for you is all, Ginny says, taking a few steps back. I don't want to make things worse for either of us. They lock eyes with one another across the silent gallery. Are you after being afraid of me, Ginny? Daniel asks her, holding his breath. Suddenly, this is the most important thing to him. Not whether he is going mad, or whether hell ever managed to spread Petra's ashes and get on with his life. Only if Ginny puts him in the category of the volatile monsters of her past. She holds his eyes with hers. No. Then it's settled, so, he says, taking back his breath. No conflict here. Just an Irishman with an active imagination. You've got nothing to run from with me, Ginny. Are you sure? She asks. I am, he says, feeling a new sense of confidence. If she believes in him, perhaps there is something in him worth saving. He walks over and joins her. They turn and look at the painting again, lose themselves for a minute in the rich calm of brushstrokes on canvas. Daniel doesn't believe a student could have done such a thing on Da Vinci's behalf. He whispers sideways to Ginny. Besides, who will protect me from the likes of those Australian women if I don't have you along? I think you are capable of taking care of yourself, she says, a hint of a smile forming on her lips to match Da Vinci's muse. Sure, one of them tried to flash me on my way to the toilet in Espinosa. She turns to him, mouth open. They did not. All right, perhaps that's a lie. But she was dressed in a tattered old bathrobe and I felt like I was after being flashed. Scarred for life, I'm sure. He takes a few steps toward the main sanctuary exit and crooks his elbow. Come on, there's far more to see in here than Mary Mag. Ginny wavers for a second, her head held as if pondering a question. Then she moves forward and takes his arm. I hear they have a giant mechanical doll on the west wall that chimes the hour, Daniel tells her as he escorts her across the room. It's almost 9 o'clock, she says. Not a Da Vinci, but worth a look. They walk out of the gallery together, leaving the watchful eyes of Mary Magdalene behind. The Camino out of Burgos is difficult to track. The busy streets and bustling commerce compete for a pilgrim's attention, and it's easy to miss the waymarks. Eventually, Daniel and Ginny find their way out of the city and onto the flatness which hallmarks the beginning of the Camino's infamous Meseta region. Infamous with pilgrims, at least. This section of the Camino is home to vast and level open plains that last for days upon days of walking. The terrain is easier on the back of the legs than the mountains and Sierra they left behind, but harder on the shins. Daniel grits his teeth at the blister he has developed on the side of his foot. Ginny stops to take breaks more often than is normal for her. The weather has changed. Rain from the day before has freshened the wind, and the air is cooler and crisper, more like autumn back in New Jersey, where Daniel and Petra would walk among the fallen leaves and talk of learning plans and the latest crop of students. She tended to each pupil as she did to her painting, with appreciation for the different textures and hues. He can remember her laugh as she recalled the pranksters and her furrowed brow as she felt for the shy ones. All on a backdrop of cool breezes and blue sky. The sense of déjà vu is so intense that he is afraid if he looks beside him he will see Petra again instead of Ginny, substituting one for the other as she suggested. He concentrates on the road ahead, staying focused on the never-ending horizon. It takes hours to leave the built-up industry of Burgos and its suburbs completely behind. The scenery slowly changes back to agriculture, with flattened wheat fields and walls of stacked blonde hay. The multi-lane autopista that has dogged them in parallel finally branches off to the north, reduced to a black tarmac snake in the distance. Daniel and Ginny mount the quiet asphalt road into Rab de las Calzadas. The small village on a limited rise looks down on the fleeing motorway, along with the Rio Herbal that flows just outside its eastern limits. Most of the population is housed in a large nunnery in the lower part of town next to the Iglesia de Santa Marina. The remaining secular buildings are grouped at a high point circling a small main plaza with tired rose bushes planted in the middle like a life-sized centerpiece. "Where do you want to stay?" Daniel asks. There are two albergues to choose from on the square, the Libranos Domain or the Casa de Michel y Felix. Neither appears open. That's because it is still early, only just past lunch. They were both tired from the marathon trek of yesterday and had purposely planned to make it a short day. The door of Libranos Domain opens, and a large man walks out, recognizes them, and waves. "Hey, Peregrinos," the Englishman calls out, his voice barreling through the square with the precision of a bulldozer. "Casa de Michel y Felix, it is," says Daniel, taking Ginny by the elbow and leading her in the opposite direction. He leans in to whisper in her ear, "I can't believe the old codger outdistanced us." "Just keep walking," Ginny says tersely. She opens up the door of the albergue and they both go in. Casa de Michel y Felix does not contain a Michel or a Felix, but Dawes, the proprietress, is known for cooking a mean pilgrim's meal. Ginny and Daniel both oversleep their afternoon naps, a carryover from the miles of the day before and a difficult night. Daniel never did go back to bed after his nightmare and finding Ginny gone. When they finally do get up, they discover they have missed dinner. Dawes makes them a plate of leftover pork and rice to share. They eat in appreciative silence, Ginny taking most of the rice and leaving him with the pork. Neither wanted to go out for dinner and risk running into Mark. They'd managed to dodge him earlier when he became distracted with the arrival of a couple of friends, a squat young man in a straw boater hat and a good-looking girl with a too loud laugh. Daniel still can't believe the Englishman managed to pass them on the trail. Probably took a taxi partway, the cheating bastard of a princess pilgrim. When she comes to clear away his empty plate, Dawes hands Daniel a square of paper with the words Peregrino Bendicin written on it and a time, 2100H. "It's for the pilgrim's blessing," Ginny explains, reading from over his shoulder. "The Sisters of Charity have it at the convent each night." She takes a last bite of the ice cream sandwich they were served for dessert. Daniel had eaten half and then dutifully handed it over to her to finish. That's what the card says, at least. "Should we go?" Daniel asks. "Sure," she says, crumpling up the ice cream wrapper and throwing it basketball style into the garbage can in the corner. "A perfect shot." She turns to him and licks one last bit of cream off the corner of her lip in a way that threatens his state of grace again. Why not? Nuns have changed since Daniel was a boy. He remembers the sisters who occasionally visited his priest-run boarding school as diminutive women who never spoke. They drifted by in the background like shadows with their long black tunics and veiled habits. He was never quite sure what they actually did. Cleaned things, he supposed. Only now does he realize what a sexist assumption that was. The nuns at the Nuestra Señora del Monasterio do not wear veils or robes, only black skirts past the knee as his granny did. Opaque nylons cover a variety of legs ranging from sturdy to spindly, with the exception of one ancient member of the order who wears beige wool socks that droop about her ankles. A pleasant-looking middle-aged woman with a large crucifix dominating her equally impressive bosom greets them as they walk into the sanctuary. "Welcome, peregrinos. Please take a seat." She hands them a laminated blue card with a Spanish order of service on it and beams accessibility. "Do you have one in English?" Daniel asks, hopeful. "Welcome, peregrinos. Please take a seat." The nun continues to project her practiced smile to match her words. "I think she's a one-trick pony," Ginny says. "Let's sit down." The pews are made of pale, functional maple, their style unadorned. The two find a spot a few rows back from the front. Daniel genuflects in the aisle before he takes his place, appreciating the carpeting on the floor. The chapel is simple and contemporary, more reminiscent of a corporate meeting room than a sanctuary. If it weren't for the large mahogany cross at the front with Christ hanging from it in agony, Daniel would expect someone to begin a PowerPoint presentation. "Are you a practicing Catholic?" Daniel Ginny whispers to him sideways in the pew. "I told you that I am." Daniel knows Ginny's not Catholic, but he assumes she is a believer of some sort. Had seen her fashion that would scrap cross in the chain-link fence outside Logru, even mouth a prayer afterward. "I mean, are you devout?" she says. "I'm not one for Mass every Sunday, if that's what you're saying." The last time Daniel had been to a full Mass was the funeral. He and Petra had gone to church only irregularly. They liked the idea of taking time out to pay their respects to God, but they enjoyed sleeping in on a Sunday morning. "Do you believe in," she hesitates, trying to be delicate, "in everything the Catholic Church says?" Most of it. Most of it. Sure, there are things I disagree with. When Ireland had a referendum on abortion, Daniel had voted with his conscience rather than his religion, albeit by absentee ballot. He doesn't think he could ever bring himself to make that decision, but he supported a woman's right to do so. This information he doesn't whisper to Ginny, for fear that voicing such a thing in a nunnery might cause him to burst into flames in his functional maple pew. "If you disagree with it, why are you still a Catholic? Are there things the US government is after doing that you don't agree with?" he asks. "I suppose. And yet you don't stop being an American, now do you?" "I see what you're saying," Ginny says thoughtfully. "In Ireland, being Catholic isn't about religion, at any rate. What's it about then?" "Sticking it to 600 years of English oppression," he says with a wink. Ginny stifles a giggle behind one hand, and Daniel grins like an idiot. He loves making her laugh, particularly after the seriousness of their conversation in Burgos. When the welcoming nun takes her place behind the pulpit, she clears her throat and the two guiltily collect themselves as if they've been caught passing notes in class. "Señor ten misericordia. Señor ten misericordia," all the nuns repeat in unison. The nun with the slouching wool socks walks unsteadily toward the front and lights the altar candles. Daniel is briefly afraid she will fall directly into the flame of the Christ candle, but she manages to make her way to the back pew and sit heavily on a cushion. Someone else turns off the main lights, and they all wait expectantly in the dim glow until the sister at the front speaks again. "Cristo, ten misericordia. Cristo, ten misericordia," repeats the group. Daniel glances down at the laminated blue card. The words in Spanish are there for him to follow along. Even if he doesn't understand the language, he knows "Lord have mercy." Christ have mercy when he hears it. "Señor ten misericordia." Sil 10 Misericordia. The candles flicker on the front table with the ebb and flow of voices as they speak the prayer as typed on the blue card. The foreign words give an air of incantation to the blessing. Daniel searches the room, wondering where the priest is to lead the service, then gathers that the nuns take care of it all themselves. Another thing that has changed since he was growing up. Orad por los peregrinos. What does that mean? Daniel asks Ginny under his breath. Pray for the pilgrims, she says, interrupting her own recitation. She has her eyes closed, repeating the Spanish words along with the rest of the women. She doesn't need the blue card. Que el Señor dirija vuestros pasos con su beneplácito. Please don't ask me to translate that, she says, still with her eyes closed. Jenny. A sound he's heard it before. Why que si vuestro compero inseparable a lo largo del camino. Jenny. He hears it again. Just like that night, hoarse and throaty in the corn. Honestly, Daniel, use the translator on your phone. Ginny, do you hear it? What she says, finally opening her eyes and turning to him, annoyed. That, he whispers. And there it is again, that unmistakable rasp, a breath full of liquid and labor, with no life to it, a death rattle. He turns around to the back of the darkened room to see where it's coming from. The woman is there beside the aged nun with the socks, holding onto her liver-spotted hand as if they are old friends. She wears the traditional nun's garb of his youth. Blood has seeped into the white of her starched headpiece and spread like an advancing disease. She strokes the fingers of the elderly nun with one hand and holds one finger of the other hand to her lips. He notices, even in the candlelight, that her knuckles are streaked with red dirt and ooze, her fingernails broken down to the quick. Ginny, he says quietly, reaching for her beside him, but she is already up and moving out of the pew. Cristo, 10 Misericordia. Cristo, 10 Misericordia. Ginny, he yells after her. She is dashing down the aisle, past the lead nun who stops her recitation and scolds Daniel with her eyes for the outburst before continuing on again. Sur 10 Misericordia. Sur 10 Misericordia. He turns around again in his seat, hoping to see something different. The woman is no longer in the back pew. He bends forward, elbows resting on his thighs, head down, trying to steady himself. That's when he feels the crawling sensation of slippery fingers on the back of his neck. He looks down and across to see mud-sputtered hiking boots peeking out from beneath the tatters of a black robe, so close he can read the brand. Merrill, like Ginny wears. The woman's broken mouth spews the words directly into his ear as she leans in from beside him. Orad por los peregrinos, Daniel. Christ. The nuns stop their prayers, look up at him with fear and confusion. The woman whisks herself out of her seat and takes off up a side aisle and out the door that Ginny just ran through. Daniel stumbles out of the pew following her, the trails left behind by her jagged wet fingertips still fresh upon his neck. He throws open the door and runs after both women into the night. Ginny. Daniel shouts her name down the deserted street. His voice comes back to him off the limestone walls of the village. A cold sliver of moon draws out the shadows. His heart beats loudly in his chest, but it's not loud enough to drown out the chant of the nuns resuming their prayers behind the thick convent doors. He runs across the street and peers in the window of the local pub. Ginny's not there, although the local priest is looking shocked as Daniel brings his wild face up to the window. He turns and takes the stairs 2 at a time that lead back up to the plaza. Everything is quiet and undisturbed when he reaches the top. Ginny couldn't have made it back to the albergue already, he thinks. He checks just the same, panting as he demands from a stunned doors whether she's seen her. She hasn't. Outside again, he looks over the stone ledge onto the lower tier of the village. He can see most of the streets from this vantage point, and nowhere does he see Ginny. Or the other one. Everything about the village is drowsy and silent, asleep for the night, until he hears a match strike loudly to his right. Looking for someone, Mark stands only a few feet away. His face lights up orange from the long wooden match. Daniel can see his two friends behind him, holding each other up. The man with the straw boater hat pulls the drunken girl to the stone wall and forces her to bend precariously over the edge. She laughs when it hits her hard in the gut, doubling her over. Then she stands, wipes some spittle from her mouth and slips the guy the tongue. The Englishman lights his cigarette, then holds the burning match in front of his eyes, watching as the flame makes its way down to his fingers. His gold and silver rings flicker in the light. "I think I know where she might be," he drawls once the fire starts to singe his skin. Daniel forces himself to stay through the sickening odor of burnt flesh to hear what Mark knows. Once he does, he runs back down the stairs to the main street. The harsh bray of the drunken girl's laugh follows him all the way out of town. Jin is standing on the edge of a bridge looking over it when Daniel finds her. Much as she stood with him at the Salt River, except this time it is the dusky flow of the Rio Herbal that captures her attention rather than the poisoned run of the Rio Salado. The water level is low. Daniel can't see anything reflected in its murky surface, not even the gaunt moon. It is cooler outside the walls of the village, and Ginny has tied up the hood of her jacket against the wind. As he gets closer, he stops. A heavy curtain of hair hangs out of the front of her hood, and he thinks he can see something ripple unnaturally underneath. She turns and parts the hair to look at him, and the illusion disperses. "Daniel." She runs off the bridge and into his arms, burying her face in his shoulder, holding him like he's rescued her from the depths of the dark river below. He enjoys for a moment the forgotten bliss of having a woman in his arms, murmurs reassurance and other inanities. He rubs her back. Mostly he just revels in the way her body relaxes into his, buoyed by his ability to comfort her with his presence and his touch. It makes him feel like a man again. After some time he speaks, breaking the spell. "Ginny, you saw her, didn't you?" She starts to cry softly but manages to nod, still buried in his shoulder. "Who is she, Ginny?" She looks up at him, tears falling onto the strings of her hood, her mouth slightly open as if she is about to respond with a question of her own. He knows her secret now. She sees the woman just as he does. The horror of that image is what has perhaps bonded them all along. When Ginny brings her full open lips up to his own, he is not as surprised as he might have been. That kiss had been coming ever since the first night they saw the dark figure hovering over the fields of Asquita. When she finally pulls away, he still has enough wits about him to ask again, "Who is she, Ginny?" She bites down on her lower lip in the way she must know by now tortures him. Even with the fetid breath of that creature still clinging to his skin, he still feels a solid tug of longing for her. He keeps his gaze serious, hopes she can see in the dim moonlight that he is not going to be swayed from an answer despite her inviting lips. Ginny takes a step away, looks down at the ground. "It's my friend," she says. "The one who was supposed to walk the Camino with me." Daniel moves toward her, takes her chin in his hand and lifts her face up to his. She turns her head and closes her eyes. "That woman's dead, Ginny," he says. She starts crying softly again, and he takes his hand away. For a while, they stand like this together, with the sound of the weak river trickling beneath the bridge and Ginny's soft hitching breaths above it. She turns to face him again, her mouth only inches away from his. Her eyes are wide and searching behind the tears. He swears he can see a moon sliver reflected in each one. "I know, Daniel," she says, collapsing into him again. "I know she's dead." Chapter 11. Rab de las Calzadas to Población de Campos. The next morning, Ginny asks to walk alone. She says she needs some space, a nonsensical excuse that Daniel knows is polite code for bugger off. He agrees to her wishes despite what happened the night before, and they decide on a meeting place for the following morning. It is easier to do this than argue with her. She is stubborn and her mind is made up. He doesn't want to scare her away again. He checks the empty plaza before he leaves, wary of the Englishman and his crew, but they appear to be sleeping in or already gone. None of them emerges from the doors of the rival albergue. That day he walked mostly by himself, feeling out of place and sorts. The blister on the side of his foot finally gets the best of him, and he is forced to pull over and lace it with a needle and thread the way the Englishman had lectured. He chooses a bench beside a boga, which he has learned is not a corner grocery store like back in Jersey, but a dome-shaped earth dwelling built into a hillside. The guidebook says these are only used to store wine. But a middle-aged matron in a house dress comes flying out of the hobbit-like front door in the ground and chases him away with a straw broom. "My God, woman, they're just feet," he shouts as he hops away, his injured and bare foot trailing black thread. He is not usually a rude or angry man, but raw nerves are beginning to eat away at his self-control. How can the woman be Ginny's overdosed friend? It's ridiculous. And yet, the terror of those fingers on the back of his neck, the beetle he saw crawl in and out of the slack mouth in the corn. Ginny's explanation is the first thing that has made sense, yet it's preposterous. He is an engineer, after all, a man of science. He doesn't believe in Santa Campar or banshees or butter witches. He didn't even really believe in the woman who's following them, until Ginny admitted to seeing her too. He tries to put it out of his mind and concentrate on the trail, but the landscape is uneventful with little shade or notable sights to distract. Endless fields that would be filled with bright poppies and other wildflowers in the spring and summer are tawny and depleted in the fall. Wind turbines, like those head seen at Alto del Perdon, turn perpetually in the distance. The monotonous call of cuckoos distracts him, at first, then begins to irritate. If only with the frustration of trying to figure out where the bloody birds are nesting with so few trees around. He tries to find an answer in the guidebook and ends up spilling his water bottle out onto the pages. They wrinkle and he knows they will dry all stuck together. It is not a good day. He arrives in Castro Tres and signs in at an albergue with 50 people allotted to each room. They are not full, but close enough. He makes a point of staying indoors and among people. The woman, whoever she is, seems to avoid crowds. As Daniel lies awake in his bunk bed, he marks off the hours by the passing of gas and other bodily eruptions of dozens of strangers. At least he doesn't dream the one benefit of insomnia. The next day he hits the road at dawn, weary and not expecting much. Ginny is waiting for him, as promised, at the crossroads just outside of town. They exchange brief greetings, then carry on in silence, a result of the untimely hour as much as their awkwardness. He wonders where she stayed the night before but doesn't ask. He wants her to start the conversation. She finally does when they are halfway up the steep slope of Alto de Mosles. "I thought the meseta was supposed to be flat," she complains. Daniel would normally feel the need to explain that a meseta is a geological plateau characterized by alternating high plains, but he has more pressing things on his mind. "Are we going to talk about this?" So he pauses halfway through the sentence, taking an extra breath to help with the climb. "About what in particular?" she asks, stopping to free one of her hiking poles from the ground where it has gotten stuck between two rocks. "About what happened back in Rab de las Calzadas, Ginny," he says, surprising himself by remembering the name. He stops and braces himself standing sideways on the hill. He agreed to the earlier separation, but he's not letting her off the hook about this. "The kiss?" she asks innocently, and he feels his face begin to color. He's not ready to talk about that. She had caught him off guard with her lips. His body had reacted enthusiastically, but the rest of him felt as guilty as hell. "The woman," he says, picking the less frightening of the two subjects. "Who is she, Ginny?" "I told you," she says, then plants her hiking poles ahead of her and starts climbing again. Daniel follows her. "That doesn't make sense, Ginny. Are you wanting me to believe there's a dead woman following us, one of these Santa Campar or what have you?" "She's following me, not you." "And do you have a better explanation?" "I have about a dozen better explanations." He draws up beside her. The backs of his calves are starting to cry out in protest. Why the hell couldn't they have had this conversation before they had to scale Kilimanjaro? "It could be anyone dressed up to scare," he says. "Perhaps it's even that sister of yours. She sounded like a right piece of work." The words are out of his mouth before he has a chance to think about how unbelievably callous he's being. She doesn't even know where I am, Ginny says, unfazed by the sensitive subject. Besides, last thing I heard she married some Silicon Valley software exec, probably popped out a couple of kids by now. Perhaps someone else you know having you on playing a prank. Some prank. Daniel's breath comes in huffs now while Ginny keeps up the pace without getting winded. Must be the hiking poles. He decides to ask a question requiring a more detailed answer so she can do most of the talking for a while and he can save his breath. Right, then tell me, why are you thinking it's your friend? Because it looks like her, or at least what I can see of her through the you-know. Daniel knew. And that red Columbia sweater and the Merrill hiking boots that we bought together back in Berkeley, they are all hers. Sure, hundreds of people have that form of a sweater. And Merrills are as common as dirt. The last thing she said to me was that she would die before she'd let me go alone on this trip, Ginny says. Given that the woman did die, I reckon she made her choice. An inappropriate comment surely, but his sarcasm gives rise to an idea. Do you think she might have faked it, he suggests. Her death. Ginny stops now and leans on a hiking pole, pulls her water tube from where it's clipped on her shoulder strap and takes a drink. I don't think so, Daniel. I saw it, I saw her. Dead. Where? Daniel asks. She puts her hands on her hips, and the poles dangle on either side of her. In a convertible Fiat, driving 30 over the speed limit on the I-80, she says. For Christ's sake, Daniel. In a casket. At the funeral. Where else? Could have been staged, like, he suggests, but only half-heartedly. Listen, she says, this is all bullshit, I know. But all I can tell you is yes, I've seen what you see, and yes, she's scary as a Stephen King novel, but I'll tell you what else. She leans into him so closely he can smell the creamy sweetness of the calf connelette she had at breakfast. I don't care. She pulls back quickly and starts walking again. Daniel stands on the hill for a moment, stunned. Then strides up the rocky dirt path to catch up. He stands in front of her this time, blocking the way, forcing her to talk directly to him. You don't care? What do you mean you don't feckin' care? He says with heaving breaths. He's at the end of his wits as well as his lung endurance. How can she not care that a dead woman is stalking her? I mean exactly what I said. I don't care. I just need to get to Santiago. To finish this. It's all about getting there, and I'm almost halfway now. She's not going to stand in my way. Ginny takes one of her hiking poles and raises the pointed end to his chest. And neither Irish are you. The two of them come into Población de Campos in the late afternoon. By this point, Daniel is resigned to his predicament. They are being followed on the Camino by the rotting corpse of a woman who overdosed 6,000 miles away in another country. Not to worry, though, the good-looking girl he made out with 2 nights ago doesn't care, so why should he hell have to update his sister on their next Skype call? She'll be bloody delighted for him, probably suggest a good coroner who specializes in the undead. There is strength in numbers, though, even when it comes to madness, and just knowing that there is at least one other person who sees the woman makes him feel better. Although he still wants to believe it is someone made up to play the part, someone who has it out for Ginny perhaps, but she doesn't want to talk about it, too embarrassed or something similar. A person can do wonders with stage makeup. His sister had dressed as a cadaver one Halloween when she was in her first year of nursing. One of her drama student friends had gotten that goo in a tube that dries like rubbery skin, and she'd created all sorts of gruesome counterfeit injuries for herself, even worn a toe tag for authenticity. The dean had called her to the office the next day for borrowing a zippered black bag from the teaching hospital morgue. She ended up having to pay for it on account of the leg holes she'd cut at one end so she could walk. He cannot buy into the supernatural explanation that Ginny accepts despite tales of the Santa Campa haunting pilgrims along the trail or the Dutchman's talk of ghostly shipmates with messages. He wishes Rob were with them now so Daniel could bounce these latest developments off of him. He and Ginny haven't seen his familiar painter's hat in days now. They follow a jumble of crooked streets that leads them to Poblacin's only albergue, a long one-story red brick building with a flat roof. The building had operated as a school in the 60s and 70s and sits on a pleasant patch of grass, the remnants of an old playground set rusting out the back. After settling their gear and washing up, the two run into the Spaniard Daniel met at the hotel restaurant in Torres del Rio. He has used the albergue's small kitchen to make pasta with the help of some others in his group. A picnic table has been set up in the schoolyard with a collection of mismatched plates and ridged plastic tumblers for wine. "You are welcome to join us," he says, sealing the invite with a handshake. "We'll be there," Daniel says, accepting with a firm grasp on behalf of both himself and Ginny. Perhaps a little too quickly. "Do we have to go?" Ginny asks after the Spaniard is gone. She's rubbing her lower back with the heel of her hand. "It's been a long day, Ginny. If I am forced to eat another pilgrim menu dinner, I'll go mental. A man can only handle so much pork and chips." "The ice cream bars are good," Ginny says, and Daniel remembers the one they shared a few days ago. Ginny's neat little bites finishing off her half, licking what was left of the cream from her lips. But he will not be distracted. Right now, his fantasies center around getting some good honest food with fresh ingredients. What he would give for a good curry from the Indian place back in Jersey. Homemade spaghetti will have to suffice. Sure, it will be good for us to be around other people. "Simon now, Ginny." He actually bats his steel blue eyes at her, his best feature, according to his mother. He's pulling out all the stops. She rakes one hand through her hair, still wet from the shower, and looks out over the fallow fields that border the schoolyard, searching before she turns back to him and his eyes. "Okay, Daniel," she says with a sigh, "I'll go." When they sit down to dinner, he takes a quick, nervous glance around for the French-Canadian girl, but she's not at the table. 2 American women and a retired army officer from South Korea complete the guest list. The pasta has been made with ripe red tomatoes and green peppers purchased at the small tienda on the corner. It is basic but filling. Daniel shovels it in with a force only a man in need of serious carbs can muster. When he offers to contribute some money toward the meal, none of the others will hear of it. "That's not the way on the Camino, my friend," the Spaniard explains. Besides, the younger of the 2 American women says, "The wine was only €1 a bottle. I'll spend more on trips to the restroom than I will drinking it." She giggles into her clear plastic cup and the red wine froths. At the price, Daniel isn't expecting much, but is pleasantly surprised by his first glass of vino tinto, served chilled as is the custom here with fresh red wine. It's delicious. Ginny, on the other hand, hasn't even bothered to serve herself any spaghetti. There is no meat in it, so that can't be the problem. He's about to ask her what's wrong when his Spanish friend interrupts. "So, do you still plan to go to Finisterre?" Daniel the Spaniard remembers his name, while Daniel has forgotten his. Daniel finishes chewing his latest mouthful of pasta before he replies. The others wait patiently. "I do," he finally pronounces after a heavy swallow. He hadn't fully decided until just now, but yes, he will go there after Santiago. He doesn't see himself finding the right place to spread Petra's ashes before then. "I am glad to hear it," the Spaniard says, his eyes lighting up. This is the original destination of the Camino, after all, not the shrine of St. James in Santiago, the bespectacled American woman asks. She is considerably older than the young woman. Daniel places her at a well-kept late 50s. The shrines in Finisterre came long before St. James, the Spaniard tells her. Like many things, Christianity has superimposed itself over other traditions. Pagans were walking the Camino 1,000 years before Christ to worship the sun god at Finisterre. Daniel has heard some of this before at the restaurant back in Torres del Rio, but he is enjoying the deeper details. He doesn't know which he is more impressed by, the thought of the Camino predating Christianity or the fact that the Spaniard knows an English word like superimposed. "Why, there?" the South Korean asks. He eats his spaghetti with a concentrated precision that must be a carryover from his army career. This is one of the few times he's spoken. The pagan pilgrims believed the sun died at Finisterre, that the two worlds of the living and the dead came closer together there at the Costa da Morte, the coast of death. Daniel says, not particularly liking where this conversation is going but fascinated all the same. Yes, they made sacrifices there, at Arasoes, the altar where they worshipped the dying sun god each evening to the west, the Spaniard says, glancing around the table for reaction. Were they human sacrifices? The young American girl is completely drawn in now. Who knows, the Spaniard says with a wink to Daniel. Daniel doesn't wink back. He's beginning to wish they would talk about something safe, like politics or religion. Maybe that's what happened to that girl who went missing, the young woman says, spilling a few drops of vino tinto on the white tablecloth. She is making good use of the €1 bottle wine. Maybe someone took her up to Finisterre and she makes a cutting motion, dragging one finger forcefully across the soft flesh of her neck. That's ridiculous, Callie, the older American woman chastises. Daniel realizes she must be the younger one's mother. Parental wrist-slapping is distinctive in tone. Besides, I am tired of that subject. She turns to Daniel. What part of Ireland are you from? She says, smiling. We have relatives in Derry. I'm from County Limerick, in the south. Daniel doesn't bother correcting her geography, so relieved is he that they have found a different subject. Derry is in Northern Ireland, a country with an all-too-violent past that his granny had quaintly referred to as the Troubles. People often did not realize that this was a separate country from the Republic of Ireland, where Daniel is from. He gets tired of explaining that he didn't grow up with bombs in his mailbox or an uncle in the IRA. I've been living in New Jersey for over 10 years now. Sure, Ginny is from the States as well, he adds, hoping to pull her into the discussion. The American woman follows his gaze to Ginny and nods. Worrying she may misread the situation, he feels the need to explain further. Oh, we're not a couple or anything, he stammers. We came on the Camino separately, only met up on the path. He tears his throat. What I mean to say is I came here alone. But not alone at the moment, obviously. He swallows what was meant to be a laugh but comes out sounding like a suppressed hiccup. At any rate, we're only friends. Realizing he's sinking in the flood of his own babbling, he tries to divert the flow of conversation elsewhere. Jin is from California, of course. Where is it in California you're from again, Ginny? Orange County, she replies, picking at her napkin where it flutters on the table in the breeze. Originally. Daniel waits for something more, but Ginny doesn't volunteer anything further. People start to look uncomfortable. Despite the noise of Callie slurping a long strand of spaghetti up into her mouth, Daniel feels the need to fill the silence. That's right, Orange County. I was after forgetting. But sure, you live in the north of the state now. Near the prison. Tell them about where you work, Ginny. Now that's a lark. He smiles widely at her, his face cranking up a shade with the effort. Ginny just glares at him and says nothing. The American woman looks back and forth between the two and raises a finely tweezed brow to her daughter. Ginny casts her eyes down at the table, embarrassed. He has made a complete bollocks of this. This meal is wonderful, Roberto, the retired army officer finally chimes in. Thank you so much for making it. Roberto, that's his name. Daniel remembers now. Like the Dutchman. How could he forget? The group resumes conversation, obviously not believing Daniel's account of Ginny and their relationship. This irks him. Even Roberto has caught Daniel stealing glimpses of his attractive walking partner across the white-planked picnic table more than once tonight, so who does he think he's kidding? After dinner they offer to help with the dishes, but Roberto tells him not to worry. The rest of them clear the plates and head back to the kitchen to wash up. He feels like he and Ginny have been dismissed. The Camino can be so damn cliquey. Or maybe they didn't want to get involved in what appeared to be a lover's spat. As the group walks away, the young American woman lets out a raucous laugh before being silenced by her mother. She trips up the front steps in her flip-flops and through the AudioBook screen door. "Were you not after feeling well?" Daniel asks Ginny once the rest are out of earshot. He is wondering about the untouched spaghetti, her lack of interaction with the group. "No," she says, walking back toward the picnic table. "I just don't like people knowing where I'm from." "You didn't mind the Dutchman knowing? He's different." Daniel is about to ask why when a disheveled old woman in oversized army boots catches them both off guard. She has walked in from the street to the schoolyard wearing a long, stretched-out wool cardigan over a blue polyester nightdress. Her hair is flat on one side as if slept on, and she doesn't appear to have all her teeth. "Cigarette," she says, as her upper lip pulls up in a nervous tick. "Pardon?" Daniel asks, although he's heard her perfectly well. "Cigarette, por favor." She brings her crooked fingers up to her face in pantomime. "Me estoy muriendo." "What does that mean?" Daniel asks Ginny. "She says she's dying," Ginny tells him with a smirk. "Is she?" "For a smoke, it seems." "That much I gathered." "Cigarette." The woman comes closer to them now, harmless but still demanding with her one English word. She coughs, then spits out phlegm on the grass. "Charming." "I'm sorry," Daniel says. "I don't smoke." He shrugs his arms out from his sides in what he hopes is the cross-cultural sign for ain't got none. Ginny gets a bar of chocolate out of her waist pack and offers it, but the woman seems put off by this and backs away, going out to the street again through the rear garden gate. "Well, that was interesting. I hope the old girl didn't escape from somewhere," Daniel says. He watches the torn hem of her nightgown drag on the pavement as she disappears around a corner. "I kind of hope she has," Ginny says, refilling the wine from what's left on the table. She moves down the grass yard to the playground. Daniel follows. They each take a seat on one of the bleached wooden boards attached to rusty chains that pass for swings. Ginny leans back and pumps with her legs. Hinges squeak in protest as she goes higher and higher, still managing to hold on to her wine in the plastic glass. Daniel tries copying her and ends up watering the playground dirt with half of his vino tinto. After a few minutes, she slows down using the heels of her hiking boots as a brake. They make an uneven drumbeat on the ground. "It seemed very important to you to explain we went together tonight," she says as her swing arc diminishes. He starts to slow down as well, but doesn't answer her. "Are we, Daniel, together?" "Well, we're walking together, of course," he says. "We are, but I think you know what I mean." He does know what she means. He lets the swing come to a complete stop before responding. "I reckon I'm just not ready for that at the moment." He takes a sip of what's left of his wine with an arm curled around the swing chain. "Just like you're not ready to move back to the farm in Ireland?" she asks, tilting her head, her swing now stationary as well. "That's a whole different matter," he says. Damn it, why did he tell her about that? Now he'll have both her and Angela inquiring after his delaying tactics, B-days and all. "Is it?" she asks, gazing out to the west, where the sun is starting to set. It glows orange between the tan adobe dwellings of the village. "I have some things to take care of first. The house and my business," he says. Shite. What? I was supposed to call my partner's wife. Had totally forgotten about Cynthia and Gerald and their whole little drama. Well, the hell with it anyway. Even if Gerald wants him to sell, he's decided he's not going to. His partner will need to find some other way to pay his gambling debts. Serves him right after what he tried to get away with. But the business isn't the only thing, I reckon. I gathered, Ginny says. She leans back in the swing again. How long has it been since Petra died? Over a year. She looks over at him but doesn't comment. He crumples up the plastic tumbler and drops it on the ground for throwing out later. You don't understand. Try me. I don't rightly know, he says. He toes the cup on the ground with his boot, pushing it around in the dirt. I suppose it never seemed entirely real to me. Despite the inevitable lead-up to Petra's death, Daniel had a hard time with the everyday truth of it. Back home, I'd often wake up expecting to see her in the bed, he says, recalling the sunlight falling through the bedroom window, his rowing over to wrap his arm around her and finding nothing but the cold side of the mattress. It felt like a mistake, a trick. He kicks the plastic cup onto the grass, as if she might leap up from under the bedsheets and yell harder at any moment. Like the dove pan, Ginny says, putting her wine down for a moment, twisting in the swing toward then away from him. I like the dove pan. He takes his hands from the cold metal of the chains, rubs them together. I was thinking maybe since you hadn't been there when Ginny hesitates. Well, you didn't get to say goodbye and all. Maybe that makes things harder. Sure, there's that, Daniel says, keeping up the lie. He had been there when she died in the most sinister of ways. But it was more than that, something he can barely admit to himself, let alone to Ginny. Instead he concentrates on things that might have a chance of being forgiven. I don't think I ever got around to imagining a life without her, he says, shoving his hands in his pockets. The sun has almost entirely set now, the temperature dropping with it. That's why it's hard, the idea of you and me. It feels like him after cheating. He thinks of the heat of that kiss by the river and buries his fists deeper in his jacket. It's as if she's still here. She is still here, Ginny says. She's in a bag in your backpack. I reckon you know what I'm saying. I guess I do. She pauses, draining the last of the wine and dropping the cup. But you know, Daniel, that she isn't really here, right? Daniel feels his pride bristle. I know that, Ginny. I'm not daft. It's just you keeping her here, says the woman with a dead addict after her. That's a cheap shot. She pulls her fleece sleeves down over her hands from underneath her jacket. You're not the only one feeling guilty here. Daniel remembers the discussion beneath Da Vinci's portrait of Mary Magdalene. Sure, you're not talking about when you and your friend were kids, what harm, Ginny, but that wasn't your fault. Ginny glares at him. Have you ever known a person who is battling an addiction, mental illness? Daniel had a cousin who suffered from an overwhelming desire to eat chalk, but he doesn't think that counts. No, he says. Then you wouldn't know. He lets that fair comment settle for a while. Eventually, she continues, less defensive. I wanted to help, but sometimes it could be so hard. She lowers her voice. She could get really difficult. Daniel nods. If her friend really was the one following them, then he knows how feckin' difficult she can be. I started to find reasons to avoid her, Ginny continues, her voice betraying a small tremble. I told myself she needed to learn to stand on her own, you know, to get stronger. That's what the Al-Anon people tell you. No enabling. But the truth is, I guess, I wanted to distance myself for my own protection. I was doing the right thing for the wrong reason. Sometimes that's the best a person can do, Daniel says, looking away. For the second time this evening he feels the conversation take a turn down a road he doesn't want to travel. I just wonder if I could have done something, you know, to change things. Ginny digs a couple of fingers into her thigh as if to remove something stuck to her hiking pants. The nails make a little shriek as they drag along the fabric. Her overdose is on her, Ginny. That's a bit cold. A person can't be laying their offences on anyone else's doorstep, Daniel says. How can you say that? Ginny grabs tightly onto the chains, stops twisting in the seat to address him steadily. Sometimes people can't help themselves. Sometimes things get out of hand. And you think that's why she's following you on the Camino, because you were after causing her death? Daniel doesn't appreciate any line of thinking that will make the dead woman any more real. Simon, Ginny, he says, discounting her. Never a good plan with women or anyone else. I didn't say that. Ginny twists away from him, pinching her finger in the chain. Jumping up, she thrusts the sore digit into her mouth to suck on it. The swing bounces back and forth, empty as if she was still in it. I was only after saying. You were only saying I should get over it. And in that, you'd be a hypocrite, Daniel Kennedy, she says, taking the finger from her mouth. She stoops over, picks up her discarded wine tumbler from the ground. I'm not the only one who's followed on this Camino, she says to him before she turns to leave. The only difference is I don't carry my ghost in my backpack. She's up the yard and back in the Alberg's front door before he has a chance to call after her, probably a good thing. He's not sure what he'd say. After all, she's right. Nothing leaves a man more speechless than being faced with the truth about himself. But he won't go in after her. He has enough wounded ego for that. He knows he's been harsh, even sullen. He blames it on lack of sleep, the stress he's been under. Despite his talk earlier of culpability and doorsteps, the young American woman's laughter drifts out the window of the Alberg, followed by a loud bang and her mother hushing her. 10 to 1 the girl throws up in her bunk bed. He hopes Ginny called the top one. After a while he starts to feel childish sitting out on the swings all alone. He stands up to go inside. When he bends down to retrieve his plastic cup, he sees a pair of army boots planted in the grass off in a darkened corner of the yard. The old woman in the nightdress comes out of the shadows. She's got a cigarette now. By the cloying perfume of the smoke, he guesses it's Turkish. Es lo que hiciste, Peregrino, she snaps at him, her rheumatic eyes focused in accusation. Ah, Jesus, he says, in no mood for this. No entiendo. The woman moves with incredible agility for her age and is up in front of him before he has a chance to react. Then she speaks to him in perfect English, so close she gets old lady spittle on his jacket. I know what you did, Pilgrim. She steps back and takes another hit of the heavily scented cigarette. Behind her he sees another figure standing at the playground gate, like a mother waiting for a child who will never come. The old woman goes to join her, and their heads touch as they exchange whispers. Laughter breaks out between the two of them, one hacking and rattled, the other hollow and mewling, a sound made less than human by illusion or design. He backs away to the porch of the old schoolhouse, never taking his eyes off either of the women that cackle into the night. He locks the old school door firmly behind him, hoping to God it will keep both of them out. Chapter 12. Población de Campos to Calzadilla de la Cusa. There are 2 ways to Calzadilla de la Cusa on the Camino. One is by a shaded path that runs beside the soulless N120 autopista. The other is along the 2,000-year-old Via Aquitania, the Roman road. It's a 10-mile walk with no water or toilets, Daniel tells Ginny over lunch in Carrin de los Condes. There he has managed to find his favorite adopted country cuisine, the American hamburger. If it was good enough for Caesar, it's good enough for me, Ginny says, picking across the table at the salad that came with his meal. They sit outside at a patio table in shorts. A blast of summer has returned for one last kick at the weathercan before the tempered chill of northern Spain's winter starts to set in. Neither she nor Daniel has mentioned their argument on the swing set. The unresolved conflict draws a curtain between them that they hide behind with weak attempts at good humor. Arguably, Caesar had an entourage to carry him, Daniel says, holding the guidebook map open with his elbow as he grabs onto the greasy bun of the burger with both hands. We won't be so lucky. They had already traveled almost 10 miles that morning, having made a brief stop to find and visit the church dedicated to Mary Magdalene in Población. It had been closed. The only trace of the saint was a sad little battle-grey statue covered in bird droppings propped high in an alcove above the doorway. La Magdalena held her raised hands together, as if pleading for release from her beshitted pedestal prison. Ginny took a picture for her collection. I'm okay to go alone, she says as she polishes off the last limp leaf of the salad. If you want to go the other way. Okay, Daniel says, still chewing on his burger. They both know he's coming with her and that she'll let him, despite their exchange of words last night. Daniel would say he feels a sense of responsibility to their partnership, though, in truth, that sense swims through a strong current of all the other complicated feelings he has for her. If it hadn't been so hot, it might have been all right. If the weather had been more seasonable. If the afternoon sun hadn't started to cut them down like a sweltering lumberjack with an axe to grind, they might have warmed up to each other again with a cooler day. But it didn't turn out that way. The top of Daniel's head roasts under his hat, and the shade is non-existent as they make their way on the raised gravel road, elevated by 100 tons of rock substrata thanks to Roman slaves. Daniel hasn't seen a tree since they passed some stunted broom bushes in the monastery ruins just outside town. Both the water bottles and the bladder in Ginny's backpack are empty. Ginny had forgotten to refill it at the restaurant. They had taken a break earlier and Daniel had rooted through his own pack, hoping for a forgotten apple or orange with juice that might help to slake his thirst, but all he found was a saliva-sucking honey granola bar. Ginny told him he was lucky to have that. He told her she should have refilled her water at the restaurant where, it turns out, he has also left his sunglasses behind. Deep in the distance, the cool shadow of mountains hovers on the borders of his sight, teasing with their snow-topped peaks. Other than those foul frosty tips, the terrain is painfully flat and unblemished. This great interior plateau region of central Spain is called, simply, the Meseta, the largest plain of them all. It extends over 81,000 miles, Daniel tells Ginny. Certainly feels like it. Of course, the Tibetan plateau in Asia is far bigger. I see. Almost 1 million square miles. It contains the third largest store of ice in the world. The monsoons. Give it a rest, Irish. He does. By late afternoon it is close to 90 Fahrenheit, a temperature swing of over 20 degrees from the day before. The Meseta can be like that. Its wide open spaces are filled, unimpeded, by whatever wind blows in. Ginny's voice is starting to show cracks like the baked mud in the fields that surround them. How much farther do you think it is? 2 miles, Daniel says, his response measured with irritation as well as distance. He's been trying to calculate their position by the amount of time they've been walking, but because there are no landmarks to gauge the progress, he can't be sure. He's been convinced they are only 2 miles away from Calzadilla for at least the last 2 hours. During that time, Ginny has asked him 4 times how much farther it is. Maybe we should go back, she says. Are you serious? Daniel asks, so forcefully it causes him to cough up a note entirely swallowed grain of granola. Or maybe turn off the Roman road, she says. See if we can find the autopista again. Take a look at where we are now, Ginny. Daniel gestures to the expanse of nothingness on either side of them. A man could sit on his porch and watch his dog run away for a week for Christ's sake. I'm just saying. You don't have to get so goddamn touchy. I'm not touchy, he says, kicking a piece of gravel with the defiant toe of his boot. She ignores him, shields her eyes against the sun, and scans the trail up ahead as they follow a curve to the left. Wait, what's that up there? She says. In a small depression in the landscape, a 1-lane paved road bisects the Camino. The view is distorted by bent air that waves up from the hot tarmac. They can both just make it out, off to the side, a blot of color and 2 or 3 rough-leaning structures. As they walk, the hazy images sharpen into recognition. My God, Daniel says. Are those teepees? Ginny says, shading her eyes from the sun. It cannot entirely eclipse a sliver of her delight. The proprietor of the roadside rest stop not only has teepees but also hammocks and, frustratingly, a broken water pump. He stands shirtless behind a makeshift bar made from a surfboard and 2 orange crates, all draped beneath the roof of a large Indian rug. A neon sign with no electricity to light it is tied precariously to an imitation palm tree. It reads with dimmed but hopeful hospitality, "Welcome to the El Macambo." Sorry, man, I'm usually only open in the summer, he says in perfect English when they inquire after cold beverages. I came out today to take down the teepees. He turns around and starts rifling through an old-style stainless steel cooler behind him. When he bends over, his loosely tied loincloth forces Ginny to avert her eyes until he stands up again. I've got this, though, he says, holding up an opaque black bottle with a white triangular label. Bold calligraphy spells out the brand Hendrix. Sorry, no tonic, he apologizes as he pulls out 2 shot glasses and places them on the surfboard. Ginny sighs. Great. Only rest stop in miles, and it's run by a hippie exhibitionist selling moonshine. Daniel steps away from her potshot and up to the bar. I think he'll take some of that moonshine if you're pouring. The tension of last night and today have been simmering within him alongside the elements. He needs cooling off inside and out. A cold beer would suit better, but hell, take one of the best gins in the world instead, if that's what's on offer. He sits down on a crooked three-legged stool and drops his backpack to the dusty ground to fetch his wallet. How much? Donativo, my friend, only donativo. The hippie indicates a large mason jar on the broad end of the surfboard as he serves. Daniel drops in a couple of euros. They join a business card and a large ball of tape. A man can't afford too many bottles of Hendrix on Donativos, I'm thinking, Daniel says as he throws back the gin all at once. It races down the parched horizon of his throat like liquid lightning. The Camino provides, the hippie says, tossing back his own shot. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand, leaving a little bit of saliva behind in his beard. And I must provide for the pilgrims, he says. It's my duty. A frightful disability is duty, Daniel says with uncharacteristic cynicism as the hippie pours them both another shot. The hippie is like the woman volunteering in the albergue back in Gran, once a pilgrim, now a penitent who serves others. I gather you walked the Camino before, so? The first time was in 1974. Walked it 5 times since then. The Camino gave to me. Now I give to the Camino. It's payback. Jesus, how old is this guy, Daniel thinks. Then looks a bit closer at the crow's feet around his eyes, the patches of grey sprouting in the unkempt garden of a beard. He puts back another shot of the premium liquor. It doesn't quench his thirst exactly, but it is starting to help him forget about it. Sure, your English is very good, he says, fighting back a belch. I'm from Boston, the man tells him, going to pour a third, but Daniel holds his hand over top of his glass. I met someone here during university. Never left. He puts the bottle of Hendrix down without pouring himself another, lights up a hand-rolled cigarette instead. You know how it is. I know, Daniel says, then turns around to see if Ginny is listening, but she's gone to check out one of the teepees. He watches her cautiously opening a flap of canvas to peer inside. The hippie barman follows his gaze as she bends over to get a better look. Oh, we're not together, Daniel finds himself explaining for the second time in 24 hours. He cocks his head in Ginny's direction after turning back to the bar. She's just a friend. She is, asks the hippie, scratching his beard. An act that Daniel notices with relief removes the speck of saliva. It had been a visual distraction, much like the guy's loincloth. A woman like that can be hard to stay friends with, he says with a smile. And how long have you and your friend been walking together, he asks, leaning on the bar. A week, maybe more. Daniel can't seem to remember how long it's been now. Time can be tricky on the Camino. Then again, he can't remember being poured a third drink either, but there it is in front of him. He picks it up and rolls the cool glass between his fingers without bringing it to his lips. The man nods and uses a surprisingly clean rag tucked at his waist to wipe down the surfboard. This is a tough part of the way, he says. The meseta. They're all tough, surely, Daniel says. As hard and hot as today's walk has been, Daniel knows the Pyrenees were no picnic either. Straight up for miles and then a femur-jarring descent on loose rocks after you finally made it over the pass. His shattered kneecaps felt like a box of cornflakes afterward. Some people didn't even make it over the mountain range. There have been deaths, heart attacks from the effort, or people who got caught out on the peaks after dark or in storms. Daniel was in decent enough shape, but it had still taken him 8 hours to hike the pass. Each of the 3 stages is challenging in its own way, the hippie says, still polishing the bar. The faded denim irises of his eyes are surprisingly clear as he lifts them up to Daniel. They mesmerize Daniel slightly. And what are the 3 stages, Daniel asks, putting his glass back down unemptied. He is still unable to look away. Well, the first part of the Camino is for the body, the hippie says, dropping his gaze and the polishing rag to fetch the burning cigarette. It's been resting perilously until now, the lit end jutting from its perch on the board. You either get strong or end up in the hospital in the first part. Daniel remembers his cereal box knees and nods in agreement. The second part is for the mind, the bartender continues, pulling the smoke of his hand roll deep into his lungs. Daniel can see the rib cage of his skinny, hairless chest expand. The same mess at a landscape for days, he tells Daniel. Nothing to feed the brain but an endless pancake of open ground. A pilgrim's thoughts turn inward. You can start to lose your grip with the monotony in the second part. Daniel nods again. This is the phase they are in now, and despite everything, he's glad to have someone with him. He doesn't know what his mind might do with that monotony if he had only himself and his darker thoughts to break up the scenery. What's the last part for, he asks, lifting the drink to his lips. This time the gin tastes sour. He grimaces. The soul. Santiago, Daniel says. The cathedral. Not just the cathedral, my friend. Everything that leads up to the cathedral. Everything you were hoping to find there. Like the bones of St. James, Daniel says, his cynicism returning. Is that why you're walking 500 miles for some 2,000-year-old bones? Surely the Catholic Church has more impressive skeletons in the closet, Daniel says, trying to lighten the conversation with a whiff of sacrilege. The hippie lets it drift away before he goes on. No matter what you think you'll find in Santiago, it all comes down to faith, my friend. Faith that there is something you are walking toward, something that will alter you as a person. He leans his elbows on the surfboard bar and blows two smoke rings up and to the right, one inside the other. They float past the fake palm tree, then disappear. Not all have a life-changing experience when they finish the Camino, he says, turning his attention back to Daniel. Oh, some say they do, but it is like the story of the emperor and his new clothes. The naked truth is they walked all that way and found nothing at the end of it. So, you're saying I'll either find my faith or lose it by the time I get to Santiago, Daniel asks. I'm saying you'll either find or lose your soul, the hippie says as he drops his cigarette butt into a rusty tomato can on the last part. He whisks away the two shot glasses and drops the Hendrix back in the cooler. But the way is full of lost souls, my man, or haven't you noticed? I thought you were the Irishman that didn't drink. Ginny is standing behind him now. Her sudden presentiment knocks him off his stool and out of the spell the bartender wove around him. And it is some sort of spell, he thinks, as he rights himself with one unsteady hand. How else could he explain having just consumed 3 shots of gin in quick succession without fully realizing it? Ginny's right, it's not like him. I ought to get going, I suppose, he says, straightening up. We're wanting to get to the next village. Daniel starts to collect his things, drops a few more euros in the donativo jar. The hippie comes out from behind the surfboard and puts a hand on his shoulder. Leather and cloth bracelets tied in knots on his wrist slide down the mahogany tan forearm. Listen, man, why don't you come in the truck with me? He gestures to a late model opened pickup parked partially behind a wall of hay bales. I got a buddy in Calzadilla with a nice little hotel. I can take you there, set you up. I think you've walked enough for the day. He looks up at Daniel, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. The man barely comes up to Daniel's chest. Daniel hadn't realized how no-mic the guy must have been standing on a crate behind the bar all this time. Ginny leans in. Let's go, Daniel. Sorry, bro, got to listen to the missus, Daniel says, chuckling and wrapping an arm around Ginny, a poorly thought-out maneuver. She tenses and makes a face as though she would enjoy running him through with one of the teepee poles. His arm beats a hasty retreat. Somewhere in the recesses of his lit-up cerebellum, he realizes he has made a grave tactical error. He never should have gotten so heavily into the Hendrix with a hypnotizing little leprechaun. Chastising himself, he pulls on his backpack, yanking on the strap of the hip belt with a vengeance. It bites into his gut where the gin and the granola bar have set up for a quarrel with one another. Thanks, he says, reaching over when he's done gearing up to shake the little man's hand. It turns into one of those overhand clasps like they did in the movie Mod Squad. Take care of yourself, my friend. I will, Daniel says, hurrying off after Ginny. She is already back on the trail, speeding up to go ahead of him. Definitely pissed, he assesses, even as he runs to catch up. I don't like that guy, she says. They cross to the other side of the one-lane road. The tarmac radiates heat and is buckling in places. Not one car has passed over it since they've been there. Why not? Daniel asks her. I thought he was grand. That's because he only had eyes for you, she says. Perhaps. Daniel had gotten a similar vibe but didn't have a problem with it. Neither did Ginny, he was sure. After all, she was from California. Jealous, he teases her, feeling lightheaded and witty, a combined illusion Gin is all too famous for. She speeds up on the hot trail and doesn't answer him. She isn't in the mood, he reckons, for teasing. I thought you said it was only 2 more miles. Ginny sucks on the tube to her backpack hydration bladder, trying to siphon out a few drops. It makes a sound like a straw at the bottom of a milkshake. I thought you said you were fine to go on. Daniel had pointed out the hippies often not long after they got back on the trail. They could still walk back and take him up on a drive the last of the way, Head said. She'd been adamant in her refusal. He's starting to wish Head pushed the idea a little more. I am fine to go on. Are you? She says sharply. They've been bickering with each other for the last half hour. Tired, hot, dusty from the trail. Daniel can feel the fine grit in his mouth, grinding on his teeth. The vast meseta still surrounds them, as flat as ever, but the Roman road built through it has begun to swell and recede in a cascade of rises that test their patience as well as their endurance. Maybe we should take a break, Daniel says, looking out over the horizon at the Camino disappearing over the next small hill, and the next and the next. We just took a break. Well, maybe we should take another one. He pulls his pack off roughly and throws it down on the ground, and a grey dirt cloud flies up into his eyes. He turns away, rubbing them with both his fists. Once recovered, he opens the ties of his pack and pulls out the guidebook, flipping through it hastily. The pages make noisy protest in his hands. The pleasant calm of the Hendrix in his body has long worn off and left him with an angry rot in his gut. He's not at his best. I don't know what you think you're going to find in there, Ginny says, throwing her own backpack down. It's not like we could have missed Calzadilla. There's been nothing for miles. Daniel ignores her, running his finger along the yellow dotted trail in his guidebook. He still can't figure out where they are. They've crossed a couple of muddy streams on their way, but nothing big enough to warrant an entry on the map. They've been walking for so bloody long. They really should be there by now. He narrows his eyes, inspecting the map, the sweat dripping down the back of his neck, convinced something will make sense if he just looks long enough. Ginny throws off her own backpack and sits down hard on the gravel path, her back to him. I hate this part, she says under her breath. Daniel looks up from the guidebook. What do you mean, this part? He closes the book in his hands with a snap, raises his voice a bit. It would echo if there were anything for it to bounce off. What do you mean, Ginny? Nothing, she says, still not turning around to face him. You said you hated this part, he reminds her. Like you're after doing it before. She doesn't answer him. He throws the guidebook back in his pack, cinches it closed again. He takes a step closer to her. Have you? Have I? What? She says, standing up, brushing the gravel residue off her hiking pants. Have you walked it before? So he says, grabbing his pack and slamming it on his back. The loose sternum straps slap him in the chest. Like the Englishman said, he's not sure how it really matters. Who cares if she walked it before? Although it seems strange that she would lie about it. The possible deception fuels his rising temper. The last week has taken its toll, just as the Roman road has. Are you going to believe what that asshole says? Are you after giving me a straight answer? She sighs and then tries to reason with him. Listen, Daniel, you're hot, we're both exhausted. It can't be that much farther. Let's just keep. What's that? He's looking past her, ahead on the trail. A shiny twist of silver winks at them from atop the next hill. Is that a water pump? He cries out. The metal spigots are usually marked on the map with a blue F for Fuente, fountain, but he hadn't seen any when he consulted the guidebook. The prospect of water for his swollen tongue diverts him from his interrogation of Ginny. He begins marching toward the twinkling flash. Ginny follows him at a distance. As they approach, it becomes more and more apparent that this is not a Fuente, too low to the ground and the wrong shape. When they get close enough, they stop. Ginny warns him quietly. Don't touch it, Daniel. What the fuck is this? Ginny, the shiny pan with the fitted top, sits in the middle of the road like an untripped bomb. I don't know, Daniel. You don't, do you? He says, spinning around to face her. He is seething with anger now. He would spit on the trail if he had any saliva left. It's a dove pan, Ginny. What the hell do you think a dove pan is doing in the middle of the Camino? I don't know, Daniel, she says again weakly. I'll tell you what. It's here because I told you about it. And either you're some sick bitch or... No, Daniel, no I didn't. She's starting to cry now, but he can't bring himself to care. His rage lifts him up, carrying him away. Did someone put you up to it? Was it that gobshite Gerald pay you to try and drive the pathetic grief-riddled Irishman mad? Did he? Now it all makes sense. Gerald could have arranged for this whole little charade, the woman following them, Ginny. All just designed to drive Daniel off the edge so Gerald could take control of the business and sell it out from under him. He looks down at the covered pan and then turns to Ginny, challenging her with his eyes. She still cries with what he firmly believes to be crocodile tears. Don't do it, Daniel, she says, her voice pleading. What an actress. And had almost fallen for it. Such a fool he's been. He reaches down and lifts the lid of the pan, throwing it off the side of the raised road into the cracked earthen field below. The charred white feathers of the still bird inside flutter as a coward of a breeze blows over the crest of the hill. The hell with you, Daniel says. The hell with all of you. He steps around the glittering pan and carries on walking the trail, leaving Ginny and the dead dove behind. When Daniel finally makes it into Calzadilla de la Tusa, he walks right past the municipal albergue with its communal quarters and checks in at the local hotel. He tells the proprietor that the guy with the Hendrix and the surfboard bar sent him and receives a hearty welcome he sadly has no stomach for. After drinking copious amounts of bottled water at supper, he moves on to the bar and spends so much time there he doesn't get up to walk the next morning. Instead, he lies in the bed of the boutique hotel and drifts in and out of a fitful sleep, thrashing on the expanse of white cotton sheets, boundaryless after the familiar containment of his sleeping bag. He awakes to a pounding headache sometime after lunch, its origin as likely from heat stroke as his trip to the hotel bar. Getting dressed and swallowing a few aspirin, he takes the richly carpeted staircase down to a more modest lobby restaurant in search of coffee and Wi-Fi. You better watch it or you're going to become a stereotype, Daniel. Angela arches one disapproving eyebrow at him from the screen of his phone. There is only one thing more clear than a grieving Irishman, and that's a hungover one. Stop, Angela. Daniel downs half of a bottle of water he ordered with his café con leche. I'm not needing this now. Fine. Whatever you say. Far be it from me to ever tell my brother when he's being a right pillock. But tell me, what does your friend Ginny have to say about this?